Here in our login form, look at the submit button. Apart from what we have here as a label, everything else should be exactly the same in every other form. So we can add a helper method in our form class for rendering a submit button with a given label. So I'm going to select this markup, cut it, back to our form class. Let's add a new method here. Render button. We give it a label and return this markup. Finally, we replace login with label. That's it. With this, we can go back to our login form and call this .render button, give it a label, login. Save the changes. And here's our button. Beautiful. Now look at our input fields. We have a repetitive pattern here. For example, the name that we set here, in this case, username, we have a property with the exact same name in our data and errors objects. Also, for every input that we add to this form, we should handle the onChange event. If we don't do this, our form will not be in a valid state. Because as you learned earlier, whenever the user types something into this form, we want to make sure that the state is updated. We don't want to remember to handle the onChange event. So, similar to how we extracted a method to render the submit button, we're going to extract a method for rendering an input. So let's select one of these inputs, cut, back to our form, add a new method here, render input. And here we return this markup. Now let's see what we need here. First, we need a name parameter that we're going to use here. So let's add name and replace this username with name. Now, as you can see, we have a property with the exact same name in these two objects. We can get rid of these and use bracket notation to simplify this code like this. So data of name and errors of name. Isn't that better? That's much better. What else do we need here? A label. So let's add a label parameter and render it right here. We're done with this method. Now back to our login form. Here we call this .render input. The name is username and the label is username with a capital U. Now let's get rid of this second input and duplicate this line. Finally, let's replace both these usernames with password and also change this P to an uppercase P. Now look at our render method. Isn't that beautiful? Only a few lines of code. As you can see, we no longer need data and errors here. In fact, we need to move this line into our render input method. So cut, back to our form. This is where we're referencing data and errors objects. So let's extract them from the state. And one last thing, because we're referencing the input component here, we need to import it on the top. So import input from the current folder / input module. Save. Now back to our login form. On the top, we no longer need the input component, so let's delete it from here. That is better. So here in the browser, you can see both our inputs are rendered. Now, one more thing before we finish this lecture. As you can see, the password is in clear text, so let's fix this issue. Back to our form class, we should add a new parameter here, call it type, and pass it to our input component. So type equals type. Now we can give this a default value because most of the time we want an input of type text. We don't want to type it every time. So let's set this to text. Now, if you want to change this somewhere, we can always do so. So save, back to our login form. Here in the render method, for the username field, I'm not going to pass the type argument because I want to rely on the default value. But for password, I'm going to set the type to password. So here in our form, we're passing this prop to our input component. Now let's go to this component and apply the type prop dynamically. So input, as you can see, here we have set the type to text. Instead, we should set it to the type parameter in this method. So let's add type on the top. Beautiful. Save the changes. Let's see if this is working. It is. Beautiful. So we have fixed this issue, but we have a tiny issue in this implementation. Every time we want to apply a new attribute to this input, we have to add it on the top and then explicitly set it here. Also, as you can see here, we have a repetitive pattern. Value equals value, unchange equals unchange, name equals name, type equals type. I'm going to put all the attributes that follow this pattern next to each other. So here we have type. I'm going to move this up. Then we have name. I'm going to move this too. So in this method, there are 3 parameters that we specifically need. One is label, because we should use it here. The other is name, because we should use it for this attribute, as well as the name attribute of our input. And finally, error. Any other attributes, we can automatically pass them by using the res operator. Let me show you what I mean. So on the top, I'm going to extract name, label, and error, and delete everything else. So delete, delete, and delete. So we get name, label, error, and here we use the rest operator to get the other properties from the props object. Now here in our input field, I'm going to delete the initialization of value, unchange, and type. So delete, and use the spread operator to initialize them. So here we have an object, we spread the res parameter, and this is exactly equivalent to the code that we had earlier. Now save the changes. With this change, our input component is simpler, and next time we want to use it somewhere, let's say we want to pass an additional attribute, we don't have to come back here, extract that parameter, add that parameter to our object destruction list, and then specifically set that here. By using the rest and spread operators, we can automatically set any other attributes that are in our props object. Actually, I made a tiny mistake here. Make sure to include the name attribute here, because if you don't include this, it's not going to be part of this res parameter, because this res parameter includes any other properties other than name, label, and error. So when we use the spread operator to spread this res parameter, we're not going to include name. So make sure to add name here.